Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and today we are talking with Professor Zeynep Ton of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is someone I have long admired for her work on good jobs. She's written wonderful books, The Good Jobs Strategy, The Case for Good Jobs, and has a new paper out in Harvard Business Review, Building a Strong U.S. Middle Class Requires High Productivity, High Dignity Service Jobs. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about manufacturing and reindustrialization here at American Compass. I am always at pains to emphasize that not all jobs or even most jobs can or should or would ever be in manufacturing. In fact, part of the case for reshoring and reindustrializing is not the jobs in the factories. It is what it means for the service sector that would surround a physical economy. I always love to remind people about the wonderful documentary made by the Cato Institute highlighting the way that a town devastated by NAFTA ultimately rebounded. The way it rebounded was a Kia plant came to town, but that wasn't just about the workers in the Kia plant. That was about the workers at the pizza parlor too. And you see the clip of the Korean businessmen enjoying their pizza. And you remember that, ultimately for the economy to function well, it's a question of spreading prosperity broadly, both geographically, but also sectorally. And I think Professor Ton does a wonderful job focusing on what she calls the frontline service jobs that ultimately are going to be a bigger part of the labor market than manufacturing would ever be in a modern economy. And looking at what makes those good versus bad jobs, why really any job can be a good job, and what from the perspective of both management and policy we need to think about to get there. So really appreciated her coming on, really enjoyed that discussion. Before we get to it, though, of course, have to tell you about what's happening at Commonplace. A lot of fun stuff this week. John Ehret on why labor policy is family policy. A great feature from our very own features editor, Helen Andrews, on why illiterate high school grads shouldn't sue their schools. And our very own Dan Kishi on a survey we did on American attitudes toward labor policy and those elements of strengthening the labor movement that have widespread support versus those that don't. So take a look at all of that. Of course, subscribe to Understanding America for my latest thoughts in Substack format. And we are now midway through the month of constantly reminding you that The New Conservatives is out on June 3rd. It's an anthology of all of the best of American Compass from our first 5 years. So why wait until June 3rd? Go pre-order it today. Or if you must wait, we expect you to be in line at the store with your copy on the 3rd. But without further ado, here is Zeynep Ton. And here we are with Professor Zeynep Ton. Professor, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Oren, and please call me Zeynep.
All right, fair enough. I still like professors. It makes me feel younger.
I used to like professor when I was younger. After 50, I prefer Zeynep.
Fair enough. I guess it cuts both
Yes.
ways. We've talked in various other contexts, mostly I guess in writing for a while. We even, right when American Compass launched, we did a Q&A for part of a project we were doing on what we called corporate actual responsibility, because this question of what is a good job, where do good jobs come from, why don't we have more of them, is so central to our interest from the economic policy side, and I think you are in many ways the leading authority on it. So I guess we really wanted to start, it is the basic question, but we get asked it a lot. I'm curious how you answer it. Just what is a good job? How do you define it?
A good job can mean different things to different people. Like you and I may consider things like a sense of belonging, recognition, achievement, purpose in very different ways. But to me, a job to qualify as a good job, it has to provide some minimum conditions, and it needs to provide basic dignity. And the basic dignity comes from three related things. One is safety, right? I think we all know what safety is. The other is respect, treatment like you are a human versus a pair of hands. And then the third is economic stability. And economic stability comes from pay and benefits, schedules and career paths. And in many service industries, I study low wage services, schedules are just as important as pay and benefits and career paths in terms of providing economic stability. And, without economic stability, if you can't take care of your family, if you don't have agency and have control over your life, nothing else really substitutes for that. And what I have found in my research is that when economic stability is missing for people, there are all sorts of problems for people themselves, but there's also a lot of turnover in organizations, employee turnover in organizations. And when there is high turnover, then the jobs are oftentimes designed for the lowest common denominator, which makes the other part of dignity, which is respect, very hard to attain.
And so there's almost it's interesting, there's sort of a vicious cycle where you end up in a model, if the workers are going to come and go because they're, in a sense, unhappy with the kinds of jobs, then you end up creating jobs that in turn make them even less happy and more likely to come and go.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in environments with high employee turnover and low investment in people, what ends up happening is there are a lot of operational problems. And I would love to get into those. That's my field is. And frontline managers are constantly fighting fires. They're constantly fighting fires, and they have very little time to hire the right person or to do the right training, which means that the capability of people by design is low. And management looks at that and says, hey, we have a bunch of workers who come and go, who don't know what they're doing, so let's take decision rights away from them. Let's centralize as much as possible. Let's treat them, as one of the workers told me, like human robots. And that makes the job a worse job. That creates more mistakes, more problems. That creates mistrust in the organizations. The front lines don't trust the home office because they think the home office doesn't know what they're doing. The job they're asked to do is impossible. The home office doesn't trust the front lines. So there's a whole vicious cycle of distrust in these organizations.
And so I'm curious, both during the period you've been studying this and then thinking even more broadly, over the past century, whatever the time frame is, I think there's a perception that the trend is in the wrong direction, that work has become more precarious, that the characteristics of a good job are in a lot of cases harder to find. On the other hand, some people say, no, things are always getting better. We're becoming wealthier, and there are all the ways jobs are better than they used to be. Maybe it's all true, but at some point, one narrative has to be more true than the other. What is your perception of, and what does the data say about what direction things have been going in the economy?
I think it's true. There are different narratives that one could tell depending on where they're coming from. As I look at the more than 40 million Americans who have frontline service jobs, which is a dominant sector in the economy, what I see is low pay, unlivable pay, unpredictable, inconsistent, inadequate hours, and lack of respect. So, if you look at some of the data for the 40 million plus Americans who work in these jobs, their median pay in 2023 was less than $35,000. That's not a living pay in most parts of the economy. So I don't see a very beautiful, optimistic picture when I look at the world of work. And on top of all this, many frontline workers have multiple jobs because they can't make ends meet by holding on to a single job. What that means is that their health suffers. They can't sleep. Right? They can't spend time with their families, with their children, and that has all sorts of effects for the next generation as well. So the bad jobs don't just hurt the workers themselves, but it hurts the next generation. We see over and over in different statistics that students who come from low-income families have worse test scores than students who come from higher-income families. Bad jobs even affect the birth weight of babies, right? All sorts of impacts for the next generation. So when I look at the economy, I don't see a great picture for the working class. Now, the picture might be better for others, but it looks very different for the 2/3 of Americans who don't have a college degree.
Yeah, and I like the term frontline service job. I think it's a good way of distinguishing it because one thing that has driven me crazy, especially in the recent debates around manufacturing jobs, is you will see economists say, well, actually, the average service job pays more than the average manufacturing job, as if just
Yeah.
there's just this one thing called service job,
Yeah.
right? And it is a good way of distinguishing. Of course, there are very good service jobs. There are even very good frontline service jobs. But when you focus on that segment of the service economy that is frontline, that is where you're more likely to see people without college degrees, that is where, again, you start looking at the median job, scheduling, pay, et cetera, and it falls into this category you're describing. What is it about frontline service jobs? How would you kind of define, well, this is what frontline is, and why is it sort of a distinct category in your mind?
You know, frontline is where essential work happens. I guess one way that I define frontline is if you look at during the pandemic, what we called essential, those are frontline jobs that are in interaction with customers every day. And they are the ones who are producing the goods or services. That could be frontline manufacturing jobs, right? They're the ones working at the factories producing the goods. So I guess I would call the production workers the ones who are the frontline workers. And they are frontline because they are so important, right? I mean, that's where the customers meet the brand of manufacturers or services.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the irony. The pandemic is such a good reference point in this respect. It is exactly the jobs we couldn't do without that also tend to, in many ways, be the worst jobs, which I guess is in our cultural context that people sort of think that makes sense. In an economic context, if you think about how markets are supposed to work and so forth, it's actually a little bit puzzling. It's always fun to push folks on like, okay, well, why are those jobs that way? And it turns out to actually be somewhat difficult to explain. Working more from kind of the market intuition side, but then pulling in your experience with actual operations, why does it end up that way? I mean, you've described the sort of vicious cycle you can get into, but that doesn't explain why the vicious cycle happens there and not with marketing jobs. Why is this the part of the economy where we end up with this set of problems?
Yeah, and I think you answered the question in your you answered your own question, which is we look at the market, right? These are the jobs that can be performed by a lot of people. They don't require a certain degree. They don't require special expertise, and there's plenty of supply of people who can perform these jobs. And when we look at market, the law of supply and demand to determine the wages, then market pay ends up being unlivable pay.
But there are some companies that make them good jobs then as well,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. So absolutely. I
So
mean,
let's dive into the operations side.
I'll
Because
get to
it's
it. There's I think we have to go to leaders' assumptions about what makes good work, what makes good companies, and their assumptions around how things are supposed to work. So there's and business schools play a role in this too, right? For decades, we've taught business leaders that market pay is the right pay. Lean and mean is what drives efficiency, because the conception in the eyes of many leaders is that people are just a cost. They're another input to production, just like any other input. So what we should do, especially in industries with low profit margins, and many frontline service industries tend to have low profit margins, the tendency is to minimize labor costs, because labor is just seen as a cost. But there are other leaders who see labor completely differently. In their minds, frontline employees are the ones who drive value, customer value. They're the ones who drive profits and growth in their organizations. So they don't see employees as a cost driver. They see them as a value driver, and they invest in them. And they invest in them with good pay, good benefits, good schedules, and career paths. But it's not just investment in people. They also provide very motivating and productive work. And that motivating and productive work is both necessary for people investment And also people investment enables that productive and motivating work. So it is where the leaders come from, how they think about people, how they think about what makes a good company, that determines pretty much whether they go in this direction and in the other direction. I mean, if you look at retail, you can see a company like Costco. Right now, their minimum wage is $20 an hour, right? The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And Costco, an average Costco employee makes over $31 an hour, which is so much higher than an average retail employee. So why is that? Because at Costco, they see employees as driver of value, growth, profits, differentiation, and in other contexts, they don't.
So in a sense, you said I'd answered my own question, but you've now refuted the answer in a sense, because you've said it isn't actually the market forces.
But the market
that
forces,
determine.
that's the status quo, Oren. The thing is, that's the status quo. And there's this thing called institutional isomorphism, right? The companies tend to imitate the practices of others. The market, as the market part is so dominant that the status quo is that the companies like Costco, Quick Trip, Mercadona, those are the exceptions right now. We need to figure out a way to make those exceptions the norm rather than the exception.
And I guess one element is we'll end up a little bit talking about kind of the policy side and how that affects incentives, but it does seem also like there's something of a sectoral question as well in terms of what is it that our economy does and what kinds of jobs it creates. Obviously we are going to be a services-based economy. How do you perceive the ongoing, or what is your view about the sort of push for more reindustrialization? Is that kind of it's obviously not the whole answer. Is it an important part? Is it almost a distraction from these topics? How does it fit in, do you think?
Look, I'm an operations professor. Manufacturing is so important for a well-functioning economy. It is super important for national security, for resilience, for innovation, right? This is we've known that for a long time. Having said that, manufacturing is not going to produce the number of jobs that are needed for our economy, for the working class. Like, there were 9.1 million factory workers in the United States, more than 40 million frontline service workers. Even if we double the amount of factory jobs, and we're never going to double the service sector will still dominate. One of my favorite statistics now is that there are more people who work at a Walmart store in the United States than at all car factories combined. And it's not just final assembly. I'm also including the part suppliers as well. So yes, attention to manufacturing is very important, and we cannot provide the shared prosperity that we're looking for just with manufacturing alone. And I wish we paid just as much attention, if not more attention, when it comes to the working class and their livelihood, to the service sector, and create more respect for these jobs as well. Because during the pandemic, yes, we called them essential, but these jobs, in the eyes of so many, are oftentimes seen as dead-end jobs or stepping stone to better jobs. They're not taken as seriously as manufacturing jobs. And if you look at the history of manufacturing didn't always used to be the sector that produced good jobs, right? 100 years ago, when Henry Ford started his assembly line, it was not too different than service jobs right now. It offered low wages, a lot of turnover. The jobs were very narrow. People did the same task over and over again. They made no decisions. And, very famously, Henry Ford raised wages to $5 an hour. Economists call it efficiency wages. Yes, that helped people to buy cars, that helped reduce turnover a little bit, but the job was still designed for a human robot versus a human. And it took a long time for manufacturing to create high productivity, high dignity outcomes that we want in the economy. So I'm hoping for the same thing for the service industry as well. If this happened in manufacturing, Why couldn't it happen in service industries? Why can't we take these jobs more seriously? Why can't we design them for high productivity, high dignity? It's possible, it's profitable, and it's very much worth the effort. It's not easy. It's not easy. In our field, if you look at even manufacturing, starting in 1980s, within the same industry, with the same technologies, same structures, policy structures, there were persistent differences in productivity across different companies. And even within a company, across different plants. Bob Hazen and Kim Clark, who were in my department at Harvard Business School, had a fantastic paper about that. Then MIT had a huge study around productivity differences, found the same thing, huge differences across different companies in the same firm. And when it came down to it, was these differences were due to management practices. Right? And Sadun, Van Renen, and Bloom have a fantastic HBR paper. They looked at over 12,000 companies. They found the exact same thing. Huge differences in productivity, huge differences in innovation. And what explained these differences was management practices. And most well-known good management practices are not practiced at most companies. Only 6% of the companies practiced these management practices. I mention all this to say that operational excellence is hard to achieve. It requires competence, a lot of managerial competence, and it's not something that's so exciting. It's not something that we pay attention to. We get excited about innovation, we get excited about technology, etc. Running the business well, paying attention to operational details, that's not something that's as exciting, and that's not done as well in companies.
The story of what happened in manufacturing itself is a great example. I think a lot of people in sort of filling in that blank would say a huge piece of what happened was the labor movement, and that workers actually having power and being in a position to make demands was one of the things that is essentially forced management to think differently. There have obviously been a lot of efforts around organizing in the service sector, mostly unsuccessful. What is your perception of the role that a labor movement or unions plays, either constructively or destructively in the things that you're focused on?
I mentioned 3 things for a good job: for basic dignity, safety, respect, and economic stability, so that you can make enough money to feed your family. I think there's no question that worker power and unions in particular played a role for both safety, working conditions, and for economic stability. Larry Summers and Ennis Stansbury have a great paper that shows that the decline of unionization is a contributor to stagnating wages for Americans. No question about that. When it comes to respect, the role of the labor or union depends on how well that union relates to management, right? One of my favorite examples in 1980s, 1990s, you looked at car factories that were unionized. They provided great economic stability for workers and for the most part safety as well. But the job itself was still a mind-numbing job. It provided no dignity. It's right here. One of my favorite books is this Rivet Head by a GM worker, right? So unions can provide that economic stability and safety, but when it comes to respect, it has to come from management and the practices that they use.
And so what does influence management? I know you work a lot with management on thinking about these things. What gets their attention? What actually makes them think differently, either based on forces from the market or just arguments about what will be good for their business?
What I have found now, I started a nonprofit Good Jobs Institute 8 years ago, and we have worked with numerous companies, large and small companies in multiple sectors. And what we have found that really gets management attention is when they believe and when it's clear to them that investing in their workers and investing in good operations in their work drives customer value, which drives profitability and growth. So it's the competitiveness and the competitive urgency that gets them to change. Some of them are very nice people. They are driven by ethics, by moral responsibility. But at the end of the day, especially for large public firms, they need to have an economic reason to do this, and competitive urgency we have found to be the most compelling reason for them to change. They're convinced that if they don't do that, if they don't adopt what I call the good job strategy, they're not going to be able to constantly improve value for their customers, and they won't be able to achieve the profitability and growth targets that they want to achieve.
And so what does that mean for the concept of labor shortages then? I'm very curious. When you see somebody complaining about a labor shortage, is your reaction, my reaction, a lot of what American Compass does is argue that's good. The bigger the labor shortage, the better. That's exactly where the urgency is going to come from. Is that right, do you think, or is that oversimplified?
I think it's a little bit oversimplified for this reason. And I think the same argument could be made for increasing minimum wages, right? So if there's a lower supply of labor, wages are, if you look at supply and demand, wages are supposed to rise, and higher wages, you could imagine, could push some companies to pursue high productivity practices. Right? And if that's the case, then that's great. And those high productivity practices have a lot of components into them. But higher wages might also push companies to look for, social technologies that just replace labor with technology, or look for ways to reduce the number of people that they have. So I think at the end of the day, again, it's about the management's reaction to the labor supply or the higher wages than the policy itself.
But isn't the reducing the number of people part and parcel of the solution? If we're talking about higher productivity, higher paying jobs, by definition, doesn't that mean introducing more technology, reducing the number of workers they need for a given amount of output? That seems like not only is that an inevitable consequence of everything we're talking about, it's something we should want.
Look, I think that's what happened in the manufacturing context, right? This is and competition is wonderful. In the manufacturing context, companies like Toyota came in, and they were able to pay their workers just as well, but they achieved much higher productivity, much higher quality, and they were the winners in that environment. So hopefully, higher wages will drive more companies toward that approach, but it's not guaranteed. And those that don't may end up not surviving, like you mentioned, but it will likely take a long time. One of the papers that I I won't get into that paper. That's
the management practices that you keep mentioning. And I think you've said, most managers want to do a good job. Obviously, they have a lot of other pressures on them. I also wonder about who the managers are, and where our economy sends its talent, where our top business schools send the people who will be the top managers, who define the management practices. How are we doing on that front? It strikes me that might be a part of the problem as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we are sending our top students to organizations to run businesses. I think still a lot of students end up in consulting or in banking sectors. And if you look at companies like Costco, Mercadona, the ones that have stellar management practices, even Toyota, I don't know that they hire a lot of MBAs. So there's a disconnect between those well-run firms and what we produce. But the good management, they're old school, well-known management practices. I don't quite know. I don't really know how to answer that question.
Well, it might be. Maybe it is unfair to even correlate what we would call, top business talent in the sense of people at the top business schools with the idea of good management practices and people who will be good employers. It could be that, in fact, what makes for a good manager and a good employer is a set of things that has nothing to do with being the sort of person who's at
I mean,
top
you realize
business
I'm a
school.
business school professor, so it makes me
Of
very
course, that's why
uncomfortable.
you would know better than
It
anyone.
makes me
That
very
is why we are
uncomfortable.
interested. That's why we want to know your opinion
Yeah,
on this exact
and
question.
it's so interesting. I'll give you one example, Oren, which I think highlights this. My business hero is Jim Sinegal, the co-founder of Costco. Costco provides over 200. It's the world's third largest retailer. Provides over 200,000 jobs, and low prices to their customers, fantastic returns to their shareholders. It's like the epitome of a good jobs company. And Jim Sinegal oftentimes talks about how they tend not to hire from business schools or even from other retailers because they think very differently. And they think very differently about labor. They have very different practices. But these practices, if you look at them, they're old school practices. Let me give you an example. When I looked into what was the secret sauce of companies like Costco, how is it that they're able to provide their employees very high wages, good benefits, and they offer the lowest prices to their customers and make a lot of money, right? Those like, it doesn't seem like from a math point it adds up. And I found that their secret sauce was certain operational choices that enabled higher productivity. These operational choices, even though they are well-known good practices, they're not oftentimes practiced. For example, I identified 4 choices when I examined these companies: focus and simplify, standardize and empower, cross-train and operate with Slack. Let me give you just one example from focus and simplify. If you go to Costco, there's tremendous clarity on why the company exists in the eyes of their customers. They offer their customers the highest quality merchandise at the lowest possible prices. And for that, they make choices. They make trade-offs. There are so many things that they don't offer their customers. They simplify constantly. What that simplification does, what that choice does, is it reduces complexity, it reduces confusion, and it makes employees a lot more productive. Costco doesn't carry a lot of products, so their employees can do their jobs faster, so they're knowledgeable about the product, so they can improve this all the time. This is so counterintuitive to how many other companies operate, right? Oftentimes the tendency is more is better. In the eyes of Costco, more is less. In manufacturing, we know more is less. Like in manufacturing, we know that companies, if you look at the car manufacturing, you can't have the fastest, cheapest, most fuel efficient, most luxurious car. You can't have a bunch of different display options, a bunch of different seat configurations, like that come with trade-offs. But those trade-offs are a lot harder to see in the service settings, and a lot of leaders refuse to make some of these trade-offs. So focus and simplify, simple practice. It requires tremendous courage to make choices. And that's not something that we teach so much about. I think going back to old school good management practices, if we emphasize them more, if we had our students spend more time in the front lines, if we created empathy for the people they will be serving, we have all sorts of programs for our students to have hands-on experience. I wish one of them was working in the front lines to gain that type of service or manufacturing experience. So those old school practices are not always practiced, and that's what differentiates companies like Toyota, Costco from the others.
Yeah, the frontline experience is a really interesting example, and the sort of thing that we probably just have less of among management than we would have in the past, just given what a lot of the paths to management might be. Is that something that I know? It's funny, like you think of the GE model, right? It's like, well, you're going to get management experience in lots of different management. Are there a lot of, besides kind of silly undercover boss style stuff, are there companies out there that put a priority on getting frontline experience for managers?
Yeah, I mean, when Jim Sinegal ran Costco as a CEO, he would spend 200 days of the year at the stores. 200 days of the year at the stores. Why? That's where the most important work gets done. Toyota leaders are similarly. Four Seasons Hotels, I met their founder, Izzy Sharp. The man is now more than 90 years old. He's still going to the hotels, right? So these leaders have a deep understanding that the most important work happens in the front lines, and I need to spend time there to understand what gets in the way of being able to do a good job. What are the issues? What are the problems? What's working well? So that connection is extremely important, and great companies, great leaders do that.
So let's talk about policy then. Our listeners are all policy people.
Yes.
They are generally, they are probably nodding along with almost everything you've said about what we want to see in the world. And then the question is, short of sort of hoping for a cultural renaissance and transformation, what levers do we actually have that we could pull that would encourage thinking in this way, that would push management in this direction? I guess as a starting point, just in terms of what is out there already, what sorts of policies have you observed that do affect management, either in a constructive way or that have exactly the wrong effect?
Maybe, Oren, I could provide not a policy answer, but a process answer to how to come to those policies, because as we work with large companies on system change, we found that looking at different initiatives and looking at initiatives in isolation is not the right way to approach system change. What works oftentimes better, and you can tell me whether this could work in the policy sector as well, policy space as well, is to first identify what is the problem that we're trying to solve. Right? What is it? Where are we trying to get to? If we say we're going to make service jobs better jobs, that's what's needed for a strong, healthy middle class. Then if we agree that the only way to get there is to create high productivity and high dignity, then that means that we're solving for, economic stability, high pay, high productivity, high dignity. Okay, so how do we get there? What is the system that enables us to get there? And when we work with companies, one of the first things that we ask them to do is, what can you stop doing? What are some of the things, I mentioned cost, focus, and simplify, right? There are so many things that they don't do in order to be able to do the things that they're supposed to do in the best possible way. So what are some of the well-intended policy choices that we have made before that don't work anymore? And again, not being an expert on policy, in the healthcare, some licensing, like, is that really necessary? Or is that a barrier because it prevents cross-training and it prevents people from being productive in their jobs? Overtime, right? Maybe overtime was very well-intentioned, but could it be that the overtime is encouraging more companies to operate with more part-timers, or even giving their full-timers fewer hours? So I guess the first question that I would ask would be, what are some policies that we have in place that prevent productivity? And let's take those out. Let's take those out, and then look at what is a combination of choices that we can make to be able to promote the outcomes that we want to promote. So you mentioned the supply, on the supply side, right? If we limit the supply, is it going to be better for companies? And my answer to you was, well, it depends, right? It depends on what else companies do. So if you were thinking on the supply side, or with higher minimum wages, which have similar intended effects, and you say, what could we pair those so that companies don't choose technology over people, they don't make that substitution, but instead they will be more likely to invest in their people. And again, I'm not the policy expert, but I'm sure smart people, when they're together and when they're thinking about combinations of things that work together to achieve the outcomes that they want to achieve, can come up with very smart policy choices that get us there.
Yeah. Well, the invest in people point is an especially important one, I think, and maybe that's a good place to end, is on the question of what does investing well look like? Because I think there's a sort of tendency, certainly among policymakers, they will say, like, well, we need more training, right? Like, everyone, like, we need apprenticeships. If we say apprenticeship enough times, surely that will solve the problem. And I certainly think we need a lot more training. I think the mental model people have of, like, well, there's just if companies just spend more on training, that will solve the problem, doesn't really understand how human capital gets built, how skills get built. What in your mind does good training look like?
Yeah.
What do companies actually do? What do we need? An education system that does better? Where does successful skilling come from?
But before we get to what good training looks like, let's look at if training could even be a solution, right? First of all, it's very hard to argue against training, right? Especially for an academic. And there are numerous papers that show that training is good for productivity, training is good for company outcomes, etc. But if we step back and say, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Okay, the problem is wages are so low, schedules are so unpredictable, so the turnover is very high. And when turnover is high, then there are so many operational problems. Companies work in a vicious cycle. Frontline managers don't have time to hire the right people. They don't have time to train. Now, you can encourage more training, but in this system, like investment in training is like putting a bandage on a wound, right? It doesn't solve the problem. So the first principles, the first things that we need to do is to solve the pay and benefits, stable schedules, that basic dignity part, so that turnover is low enough so that companies can invest in training. And then the apprenticeship model, I mean, if you look at a company like Quick Trip, I talk so much about Costco, but Quick Trip is a convenience store chain with gas stations. And there are more than about 1,200 stores at Quick Trip. And there are more millionaires. There are just almost as many millionaires in their front lines as the number of stores. This is a convenience store chain with gas stations. Right? At this company, frontline managers make well over $100,000. And at age 55, long-term people are supposed to retire because it's a physically taxing job. And when they retire, they're supposed to earn the same income they earned when they were working. So it's a good job, economic stability, and lots of other things. So inside Quick Trip, you can have awesome training. Right? And it goes from, you start as an entry-level part-time person, you become a full-time person, you become an expert, you can become a lead trainer, then an assistant manager, then a store manager. There is that career path within the company. But again, the same thing cannot be achieved at a company that's operating with 100% employee turnover. So before we get to the training as a solution, which is such an easy solution, I think that's why we oftentimes also go there, and it's finding the fault in people versus the system that we build. We need to design the jobs well first for high expertise before we get to the training, and that requires solving the turnover problem.
Yeah, so that's a good corrective. So because I think when somebody says we need to invest more in people, today that translates into we need to spend more on training. And would it be fair to say when you say companies should invest more in people, you mean just literally they should provide them with better jobs? Yeah. And that is right. They should raise their wages, give them stable full-time economic security, treat them with respect, make sure their jobs have dignity, and then you can talk about the training. But the actual investment that needs to occur is at that foundational level.
Absolutely. Pay, benefits, schedules, career paths, respect. And respect is also time too, right? Time to be able to do a good job, and that requires investment as well. But we need to get that first before we go to training.
Well, that is a perfect place to wrap things up. We will again refer to you as Professor Zeynep Ton. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.